Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the English Talk community. I'm Julia, and today we're going to talk about something that might change the way you think about learning English forever. You know that feeling when you study grammar rules for hours but still can't speak naturally? I completely understand because I've been there too. Today, I'm going to share with you the secret that native speakers don't even realize they use. If you want to finally speak English fluently without memorizing boring grammar rules, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel, because this episode will give you the tools you need to transform your English learning journey. I want you to imagine something with me right now. Picture yourself having a conversation in English where you're not thinking about rules or conjugations or sentence structures. You're just talking, naturally, the way you do in your native language. The words flow out of you effortlessly, and you feel confident and relaxed. This isn't a dream, and it's not impossible. This is exactly how I want you to feel after listening to today's episode. You see, I've been teaching English for years, and I've noticed something fascinating. The students who become fluent fastest are not the ones who know every grammar rule by heart. They're not the ones who can explain when to use past perfect or conditional sentences. The students who succeed are the ones who listen, really listen to English every single day. They're the ones who stop trying to translate everything in their heads and start trusting their ears. I remember when I was learning my second language, I made the same mistakes that probably frustrate you right now. I would spend hours with textbooks, memorizing rules and exceptions to rules and exceptions to those exceptions. I felt like I was building a house of cards in my mind, where one small mistake could make everything collapse. And you know what happened when I tried to have a real conversation? My mind went completely blank. All those rules I had memorized were nowhere to be found when I actually needed them. That's when I discovered something that changed everything for me. I started watching movies and listening to podcasts in my target language, not to study them, but just to enjoy them. I chose content that made me laugh, that made me curious, that made me want to know what happened next. And something magical started happening. Without even realizing it, I began to understand more and more. Words that I had never looked up in a dictionary suddenly made sense from the situation. Phrases started sounding familiar, even though I couldn't explain why they were correct. This is what I want for you with English. I want you to experience that moment when you realize you understand a conversation without translating it word by word in your head. That moment when you catch yourself thinking in English without forcing it to happen. That moment when someone asks you a question in English and you answer immediately, naturally, without panic. The secret I'm going to share with you today is something that every native English speaker used to learn the language, but most of us don't even remember doing it. We were too young to remember the process, but it's exactly the same process you can use right now to transform your English skills. And the best part is, it doesn't involve studying a single grammar book or memorizing a single rule. Think about this for a moment. When you were a baby learning your first language, nobody sat you down with a textbook and explained the difference between past and present tense. Nobody taught you about subject-verb agreement or conditional sentences. Yet somehow, by the time you were 3 or 4 years old, you could communicate complex ideas, tell stories, ask questions, and express your feelings. How did this happen? It happened through something so simple, so natural, that we often overlook its power when learning a second language. You listened. You listened to thousands and thousands of hours of your native language being spoken around you. Your parents, your siblings, people on television, conversations at the store, songs on the radio. Your brain was constantly absorbing patterns, rhythms, and sounds. You weren't analyzing these patterns consciously, but your incredible brain was filing away everything it heard. And then, when you were ready, you started copying what you heard. Not perfectly at first, of course. You probably said some pretty funny things that made your family laugh, but every time you tried to speak, you were practicing those patterns your brain had been collecting. The more you listened, and the more you tried to copy what you heard, the more natural your speech became. This same process is available to you right now with English. Your brain hasn't lost this amazing ability to learn languages naturally. You just need to give it what it needs, which is lots and lots of listening input in English. Not listening to analyze or study, but listening to understand and enjoy. I know what you might be thinking right now. You might be worried that without studying grammar rules, you'll make mistakes. You might think that native speakers will judge you or that your English won't be correct. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Native English speakers make what textbooks would call grammar mistakes all the time. We say things like, "Me and my friend went to the store," instead of "my friend and I went to the store." We end sentences with prepositions. We use double negatives in casual speech. And guess what? We still understand each other perfectly. The goal of language isn't to speak perfectly according to textbook rules. The goal of language is to communicate, to connect with other people, to share ideas and feelings and experiences. When you focus on communication instead of perfection, everything becomes easier and more natural. So today, I'm inviting you to try something different. I'm inviting you to trust your brain's natural ability to learn language the same way you learned your first language. I'm inviting you to fill your ears with English that you actually enjoy listening to, and to trust that your brain will figure out the patterns without you having to consciously study them. Before we dive deeper into this transformative approach to English learning, I need your help to spread this message to more people who are struggling with traditional grammar-focused methods. If you're already feeling excited about the possibility of learning English naturally without memorizing rules, please hit that like button right now and subscribe to the English Talk community. Your support helps me reach more English learners who desperately need to hear that there's a better, more enjoyable way to become fluent. I'm also incredibly curious about your own English learning journey and what brought you to this podcast today. Take a moment right now to leave a comment below telling me about your biggest frustration with traditional English learning methods, or share a time when you felt stuck despite knowing grammar rules perfectly. Maybe you've had an experience like Maria from Madrid, where you froze up trying to communicate in real life despite years of study. Your story could inspire and encourage other listeners who are facing the same challenges, and it helps me understand what topics to cover in future episodes to support your learning journey. Let me tell you about Maria from Madrid, who spent 3 years studying grammar books and could explain every rule perfectly. But when she tried to order coffee in London, she froze completely. Does this sound familiar to you? You're not alone in this struggle, and the reason this happens is because grammar study and natural communication are two completely different skills. Think about how you learned your native language as a child. You didn't study grammar rules first. You listened, copied, and practiced until it felt natural. Maria came to me after that embarrassing coffee shop experience in London. She was so frustrated because she had invested so much time and energy into learning English the traditional way. She could tell you exactly when to use present perfect versus simple past. She knew all about conditional sentences and passive voice. She had notebooks filled with verb conjugations and exception lists. But when that barista in London asked her a simple question about her coffee order, her mind went completely blank. This is what I call the grammar trap, and I see students falling into it every single day. They believe that if they just study hard enough, if they memorize enough rules, if they understand every possible exception, then one day they'll magically be able to speak fluently. But that's not how language works in the real world. When Maria stood in that coffee shop, her brain was trying to construct sentences using all the rules she had memorized. She was thinking about subject-verb agreement, wondering if she should use present simple or present continuous, questioning whether her word order was correct. While she was doing all this mental calculation, the moment passed, the barista moved on to the next customer, and Maria felt defeated. I asked Maria to think about something. When she speaks Spanish, her native language, does she stop to think about whether she's using the subjunctive mood correctly? Does she pause to consider if her verb endings match the subject? Of course not. She just speaks. The words flow naturally because she learned Spanish by listening to it being spoken around her for thousands of hours during her childhood. Maria's story isn't unique. I've met countless students from all over the world who have fallen into this same trap. There was David from Tokyo who could score perfectly on any English test, but couldn't have a casual conversation with his English-speaking neighbors. There was Sarah from Berlin who understood complex English literature, but felt nervous ordering food at a restaurant when she visited New York. And there was Ahmed from Istanbul, who could write beautiful English essays, but struggled with small talk during his business trips to London. All of these students had the same problem. They had learned English as a set of rules to be memorized, rather than as a living language to be experienced. They had trained themselves to think about English rather than think in English. And thinking about a language while you're trying to speak it is like trying to drive a car while constantly checking the manual to make sure you're doing everything correctly. It slows you down, it creates anxiety, and it prevents you from enjoying the journey. I want you to understand that this isn't your fault if you recognize yourself in Maria's story. Traditional language education has taught us that we need to understand the rules before we can use the language. But this approach goes against everything we know about how the human brain actually learns language. When children learn their first language, they don't start with rules. They start with sounds, rhythms, and patterns. They listen to language being used in real situations with real meaning. Maria had spent 3 years studying English in isolation from its natural context. She knew that "I have been working" is present perfect continuous, but she had never heard it used naturally in conversation enough times for it to feel automatic. She understood the rule intellectually, but her brain hadn't absorbed the pattern emotionally and instinctively. Think about it this way. When you learned to walk, you didn't study the physics of balance and motion first. You watched other people walking, you tried to copy them, you fell down, you got up, you tried again. Your brain and body learned through experience, through trial and error, through constant practice in real situations. Learning to speak a language is exactly the same process. Maria's breakthrough came when she stopped studying English and started living with English. I told her to put away her grammar books for 3 months and instead surround herself with English that she actually enjoyed. She started watching Spanish shows with English subtitles, then gradually switched to English shows with Spanish subtitles, then finally to English shows with English subtitles, and eventually no subtitles at all. She began listening to English podcasts about cooking, which was her hobby. She didn't understand everything at first, but she could follow the basic ideas because she already knew about cooking. Gradually, her brain started picking up patterns. She began to notice how English speakers expressed enthusiasm, how they gave instructions, how they described flavors and textures. She wasn't analyzing these patterns consciously, but they were becoming part of her internal English system. The most important change Maria made was shifting her focus from correctness to communication. Instead of worrying about whether her English was perfect, she started focusing on whether people could understand her message. She began having short conversations with English speakers online, not to practice grammar rules, but to share her thoughts about topics she cared about. 6 months later, Maria visited London again. This time, when the barista asked about her coffee order, she responded naturally and confidently. She even ended up having a friendly conversation about different types of coffee beans. Her English wasn't perfect according to textbook standards, but it was real, it was natural, and it worked perfectly for communication. What had changed? Maria's brain had finally absorbed English as a natural communication system rather than as a collection of rules to be memorized. She had given her brain what it needed to learn language the way it was designed to learn. She had provided it with thousands of hours of meaningful input, and her brain had done what brains do best. It had found the patterns and made them automatic. Have you ever watched a 3-year-old speak their native language? They don't know what a verb or adjective is, but they communicate perfectly with their family and friends. Children learn by listening to patterns, repeating what they hear, and making mistakes without fear. This is exactly the approach we need to take with English, and I'm going to show you how to think like a child again when it comes to language learning. Last week, I was visiting my sister, and I spent time watching my 3-year-old nephew talk to everyone around him. It was absolutely fascinating. This little boy was telling complex stories, asking detailed questions, expressing his emotions clearly, and even arguing his point when he disagreed with something. He was using phrases like, "I don't want to go there because it's too scary," and "Can we play that game we played yesterday at Grandma's house?" These are sophisticated sentence structures that would challenge many adult English learners, yet he was using them naturally and effortlessly. What struck me most was that he had no idea he was using language correctly. He wasn't thinking about sentence structure or word order. He wasn't worried about making mistakes. He was simply focused on communicating his thoughts and feelings. When he wanted something, he found a way to express that desire. When he was excited about something, his words bubbled out with enthusiasm. When he was confused, he asked questions until he understood. This is the natural way that human beings learn language, and it's exactly the same process that's available to you right now with English. Your brain hasn't lost this incredible ability just because you're an adult. The only difference is that as adults, we often overthink the process and get in our own way. I want you to think about how your nephew or any child you know learned their first language. They didn't start with vocabulary lists or sentence structure lessons. They started by being surrounded by language from the moment they were born. They heard their parents talking to them, singing to them, reading to them. They heard conversations between family members. They heard the television, music, people talking in stores and restaurants. Their developing brains were constantly absorbing this rich input of natural language in context. But here's what's really important to understand. Children don't just passively listen to language. They actively try to participate in communication from a very early age. Even before they can speak clearly, babies make sounds and gestures to communicate their needs. They point at things they want. They cry when they're uncomfortable. They smile and laugh when they're happy. They're practicing communication long before they can form complete sentences. When children start speaking, they don't worry about being perfect. They try out words and phrases they've heard, and they experiment with combining them in new ways. Sometimes they create completely new words that make perfect sense to them. Sometimes they use existing words in creative ways that adults find charming. They're not afraid of making mistakes because they don't even know they're making mistakes. They're just focused on getting their message across. I remember my nephew going through a phase where he called all animals woof woofs because the first animal sound he learned was a dog barking. He would point to cats, birds, even fish in a book and say woof woof. Was this incorrect? According to adult standards, yes. But was he communicating successfully? Absolutely. His family understood that he was identifying animals, and gradually, through continued exposure and gentle correction, he learned the specific names for different animals. This is such a powerful lesson for adult language learners. Children focus on communication first and accuracy second. They're willing to use the tools they have available, even if those tools are imperfect, to express their thoughts and connect with other people. As adults learning English, we often do the opposite. We wait until we think we can speak perfectly before we try to communicate at all. Another fascinating thing about how children learn language is that they're incredible pattern detectors. Without any formal instruction, they figure out complex patterns in the language they hear around them. They learn that in English, we usually put adjectives before nouns, so we say big house, not house big. They learn that we add certain sounds to the end of words to talk about more than one thing. They learn that the tone of voice often tells them more about meaning than the actual words being used. Children absorb these patterns through thousands of hours of listening and interacting. They don't memorize rules. They internalize patterns through repetition and experience. When they hear, "I'm going to the store" hundreds of times in appropriate contexts, their brain naturally understands when and how to use this pattern. They don't need someone to explain that "going to" can express future plans or that "the" is used before specific nouns. The beautiful thing about how children learn is that they're not self-conscious about their language abilities. They don't compare themselves to adult speakers and feel inadequate. They don't worry about their accent or whether they sound intelligent. They're simply happy to be able to communicate and connect with the people around them. Every new word they learn, every new phrase they master, is a victory that they celebrate naturally. This fearless attitude is something we need to recapture as adult learners. When you were learning your native language as a child, you never thought, "I'm not good at languages," or "I'll never sound like a native speaker." You just kept listening, kept trying, kept communicating. You trusted the process completely. Children also learn language in meaningful contexts. They don't learn isolated words or phrases. They learn language that's connected to their real experiences and emotions. When they learn the word hungry, it's because they're actually feeling hungry. When they learn "I want to play," it's because they genuinely want to engage in play activities. The language they acquire is immediately relevant and useful to their daily lives. This is why children remember new language so effectively. It's not just stored in their brains as abstract information, it's connected to real situations, real emotions, real needs and desires. The language becomes part of their lived experience rather than just academic knowledge. As an adult learning English, you can apply these same principles. Instead of trying to memorize isolated vocabulary words, Learn English in contexts that matter to you. If you love cooking, listen to English cooking shows and learn kitchen vocabulary naturally. If you're interested in sports, follow English sports commentary and absorb the language used to describe games and players. I want to share the story of Ahmed from Cairo, who couldn't speak English after years of grammar classes, but after 6 months of watching English shows with subtitles and listening to podcasts, he started thinking in English naturally. The key was massive input, filling his brain with real English conversations instead of grammar rules. Your brain is incredibly smart and will naturally pick up patterns when you give it enough examples to work with. Ahmed contacted me about 2 years ago, and his frustration was palpable even through his email. He had been studying English for almost 4 years at a local language institute in Cairo. He could pass written exams with flying colors. He knew every tense, every exception, every rule his teachers had taught him. But when it came to actually speaking English, especially with native speakers, he felt like all that knowledge just disappeared from his mind. He told me about an embarrassing experience he had at his job. His company had hired an American consultant, and Ahmed was supposed to be the liaison because of his English studies. The first meeting was a disaster. Ahmed understood maybe half of what the consultant was saying, and when he tried to respond, the words came out slowly and awkwardly. The consultant was patient, but Ahmed could see the confusion in his eyes. It was clear that despite years of study, Ahmed wasn't really ready for real-world English communication. That's when Ahmed made a decision that changed everything for him. He decided to try a completely different approach. Instead of more classes and more textbooks, he was going to immerse himself in English the way a child learns language, through massive exposure to natural, meaningful input. Ahmed started his journey by choosing English content that genuinely interested him. He loved technology and innovation, so he began watching technology review channels on YouTube. At first, he watched with Arabic subtitles, but he quickly realized this was keeping him dependent on his native language. So he switched to English subtitles, even though it was challenging at the beginning. The first few weeks were tough. Ahmed felt overwhelmed by how fast native speakers talked and by all the expressions he had never learned in his classes. But something interesting started happening. Even when he didn't understand every word, he could often follow the general meaning of what the reviewers were saying. When they were excited about a new phone feature, their tone of voice and body language communicated enthusiasm even when Ahmed missed some of the technical vocabulary. After about a month of daily YouTube watching, Ahmed decided to add podcasts to his routine. He found several technology podcasts and started listening during his commute to work. This was pure audio input, no visual cues to help him understand. At first, it felt like listening to a foreign language, which technically it was. But Ahmed noticed that certain phrases and expressions kept repeating across different episodes and different speakers. The breakthrough moment came about 3 months into Ahmed's new routine. He was listening to a podcast about artificial intelligence, and suddenly he realized he had been following the entire conversation without consciously translating anything. The English was going directly into his brain and making sense without any Arabic translation step. It was the most exciting moment of his entire English learning journey. But Ahmed didn't stop there. He kept increasing his English input. He started watching complete English movies and TV series. He chose genres he enjoyed, science fiction and thriller shows, because he knew he would be motivated to keep watching even when the language was challenging. He discovered that when he was emotionally invested in a story, his brain worked harder to understand what was happening. Ahmed also began listening to English music, but not just for entertainment. He would look up the lyrics and follow along while listening. This helped him hear how words sound when they're connected in natural speech, how native speakers link sounds together, and how the rhythm of English differs from Arabic. Music became another source of natural English patterns for his brain to absorb. One of the most powerful changes Ahmed made was switching his phone and computer settings to English. Suddenly, all the apps he used daily were giving him English input. His social media feeds became sources of English reading practice. Even simple activities like checking the weather or setting an alarm became opportunities to encounter English in natural, practical contexts. The really amazing thing about Ahmed's transformation was how it happened almost without him noticing. He wasn't consciously studying or memorizing anything. He was just consuming massive amounts of English content that interested him. His brain was doing all the pattern recognition and language acquisition work in the background, the same way it had learned Arabic as a child. After about 5 months, Ahmed had another meeting with the American consultant at his company. This time, the conversation flowed naturally. Ahmed found himself responding without the painful pauses and mental translations that had characterized his earlier attempts. He could understand the consultant's questions immediately, and his responses came out smoothly and confidently. But perhaps the most significant change was that Ahmed started thinking in English. He would catch himself having internal conversations in English, especially about technology topics that he had been consuming in English. When he saw a new gadget, his first thoughts about it were often in English rather than Arabic. This was the clearest sign that English had become a natural part of his mental landscape, rather than just an academic subject. Ahmed's story illustrates something crucial about language learning that most traditional methods miss. Your brain needs massive amounts of input in order to naturally acquire language patterns. Think about it. As a child learning your native language, you heard millions of sentences before you ever spoke your first complete sentence. You absorbed countless hours of natural conversation before you could participate in conversations yourself. The magic happens when you give your brain enough examples of natural English to work with. Ahmed wasn't consciously analyzing the English he was hearing and watching. He wasn't taking notes or making vocabulary lists. He was simply feeding his brain high-quality English input on a consistent basis, and his brain did what brains do naturally. It found patterns, made connections, and gradually built an internal system for understanding and producing English. What's beautiful about Ahmed's approach is that it felt effortless and enjoyable. He wasn't forcing himself to study. He was entertaining himself with content he genuinely wanted to consume. The English learning was happening as a natural side effect of engaging with interesting material. This made the entire process sustainable and enjoyable rather than a chore to be endured. Instead of memorizing that we say, "I have been working for present perfect continuous," what if you just heard this pattern hundreds of times in different situations? Your brain would automatically know when to use it without thinking about the rule. This is pattern recognition, and it's how native speakers actually use English. We feel what sounds right rather than calculating grammar rules in our heads. Let me ask you something. When you speak your native language, do you stop and think about rules before you form a sentence? Of course not. You just know what sounds right. You have an internal sense of what feels natural and what doesn't. This isn't magic. It's pattern recognition, and it's the most powerful language learning tool your brain possesses. I want to share something with you that might surprise you. As a native English speaker, I couldn't explain most English rules to you if you asked me to. If you put me on the spot and asked me to define what makes a sentence correct or incorrect, I would probably struggle to give you a technical answer. But I can immediately tell you if a sentence sounds natural or awkward. I can hear when something is off even if I can't explain why using technical terms. This is because I learned English the same way you learned your native language, through massive exposure to patterns. By the time I was 5 years old, I had heard the phrase, "I have been working," or similar patterns thousands of times in different contexts. I heard my parents say, "I have been thinking about that all day," when they were considering a decision. I heard teachers say, "We have been studying this topic for weeks," when reviewing classroom material. I heard people on television say, "I have been waiting for this moment," when something exciting happened. My brain collected all these examples and built an internal database of when this pattern feels appropriate. I never memorized a rule about ongoing actions that started in the past and continue to the present. Instead, my brain naturally recognized that this pattern is used when people want to emphasize the duration or ongoing nature of an activity. This recognition happened automatically, below the level of conscious thought. This is exactly what I want to happen for you with English. Instead of trying to memorize rules and exceptions, I want you to feed your brain so many examples of natural English patterns that you develop the same intuitive sense that native speakers have. I want you to reach the point where you can feel whether a sentence sounds right or wrong, without needing to analyze why. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Think about the difference between "I made a mistake" and "I did a mistake." If you've been exposed to enough natural English, the second phrase probably sounds wrong to you, even if you can't explain the rule about which verbs go with which nouns. Native speakers never learned a rule about make a mistake versus do a mistake. We just heard make a mistake so many times that it became the natural pattern in our minds. The same thing happens with more complex patterns. Native speakers don't consciously know that we say interested in rather than interested about or interested for. We've simply heard I'm interested in music and she's interested in science so many times that this combination sounds natural to us. Any other combination sounds immediately wrong to our trained ears. This is why students who focus on pattern recognition through listening tend to sound more natural than students who memorize rules. When you learn through patterns, your English flows with the same rhythm and naturalness as native speech. When you learn through rules, your English often sounds mechanical and forced because you're constructing sentences intellectually rather than producing them intuitively. I had a student named Elena from Prague who perfectly illustrated this difference. Elena had studied English rules extensively and could explain complex structures better than some teachers. But when she spoke, her English sounded robotic and unnatural. She would pause before each sentence to mentally check her rules, and her speech rhythm was completely different from natural English. Then Elena started watching English cooking shows because she loved baking. She wasn't trying to study English, she just wanted to learn new recipes. But something amazing happened. After months of listening to chefs say things like, "I've been experimenting with this recipe and we're going to be adding some vanilla extract," and "this has been baking for 20 minutes," Elena's spoken English completely transformed. She stopped pausing to check rules because she had internalized the natural rhythm of English through countless hours of listening. Her sentences started flowing smoothly because she was reproducing patterns she had heard, rather than constructing sentences from memorized rules. Most importantly, her English started sounding like real communication, rather than a school exercise. The key insight here is that native speakers don't speak English correctly because we know the rules. We speak English correctly because we've absorbed the pattern so thoroughly that incorrect usage sounds wrong to us. We have what linguists call native intuition, an internal sense of what belongs in the language and what doesn't. You can develop this same intuition, but it requires a shift in how you approach English learning. Instead of asking, "What's the rule for this situation?" start asking, "How do native speakers actually express this idea?" Instead of memorizing explanations, start collecting examples. Instead of studying about English, start living with English. This means choosing English input that exposes you to the same patterns repeatedly in natural contexts. When you watch English movies, you'll hear characters express emotions, make requests, and tell stories using the same underlying patterns over and over again. When you listen to English podcasts, you'll hear hosts ask questions, make transitions, and explain concepts using consistent language patterns. Your brain is incredibly sophisticated at detecting these patterns, even when you're not consciously trying to learn them. After enough exposure, you'll start to feel when something sounds right or wrong in English, just like you do in your native language. You'll develop an intuitive sense of English rhythm, word combinations, and natural expression. The beautiful thing about pattern recognition is that it works automatically. You don't have to force it or study it directly. You just have to provide your brain with enough high-quality English input, and the pattern recognition happens naturally. Your brain will start preferring constructions that match the patterns it has heard most frequently, and avoiding combinations that sound unfamiliar or awkward. This is why massive listening input is so powerful for language learning. Every conversation you listen to, every video you watch, every podcast episode you hear is adding more examples to your brain's pattern database. The more examples you collect, the stronger your intuitive sense of natural English becomes. Every fluent English speaker started with listening. Lots and lots of listening. When you focus on understanding before speaking, you build a solid foundation that makes everything else easier. Choose content that interests you, whether it's cooking videos, travel vlogs, or simple conversations like this podcast. The more you listen to natural English, the more your brain will absorb the rhythm and patterns of the language. I want you to think about something that might seem obvious but is often overlooked in language learning. Before you ever spoke your first word in your native language, you spent months and months just listening. You were absorbing the sounds, the rhythms, the melodies of your language long before you could produce any of it yourself. This listening period wasn't wasted time. It was the most crucial foundation for everything that came after. Your brain was working incredibly hard during those early listening months, even though you weren't aware of it. You were learning to distinguish between different sounds, to recognize where words begin and end, to understand the emotional meanings carried by tone of voice. You were building a massive database of language patterns that would support all your future communication abilities. This same process needs to happen with English, and listening is the most efficient way to make it happen. When you prioritize listening input, you're giving your brain the raw material it needs to construct an internal English system. Every hour you spend listening to natural English is like making a deposit in your language learning bank account. The more you deposit, the richer your English resources become. But here's what's crucial. Not all listening input is equally valuable. The most powerful listening comes from content that genuinely interests you and engages your emotions. When you're bored or forcing yourself to listen to something that doesn't capture your attention, your brain doesn't process the language as deeply. But when you're genuinely curious about what you're hearing, when you're emotionally invested, when you want to know what happens next, your brain absorbs language patterns much more effectively. I discovered this principle accidentally when I was learning my second language. I had been forcing myself to listen to news broadcasts because I thought they would be educational. But I found my mind wandering constantly. I would realize I had been listening for 20 minutes without really hearing anything. Then one day, I discovered a podcast about mysteries and true crime stories. Suddenly, I was completely absorbed. I wanted to understand every detail, every clue, every twist in the story. My brain was working at full capacity to comprehend the language because I was emotionally engaged with the content. That's when I realized that interest and engagement are not luxuries in language learning. They're necessities. Your brain learns most effectively when it's motivated to understand. When you choose English content that aligns with your personal interests, you tap into your brain's natural learning power. Think about what you love to do in your free time. Do you enjoy cooking? There are thousands of English cooking channels where you can learn new recipes while absorbing natural English conversation. Do you love travel? Travel vlogs will expose you to English descriptions of places, cultures, and experiences while keeping you entertained. Are you interested in fitness? English fitness videos will teach you exercise vocabulary while motivating you to stay healthy. The beauty of this approach is that you're learning English indirectly, while pursuing something you genuinely care about. The language learning happens as a natural side effect of engaging with interesting content. This makes the process sustainable and enjoyable, rather than a chore you have to force yourself to do. I had a student named Carlos from Mexico City who transformed his English through his passion for football. Carlos had been struggling with traditional English classes for years. He could read English fairly well, but listening comprehension was a major challenge for him. Then he discovered English football commentary and analysis videos. Suddenly, he was listening to English for hours every day, not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand every detail about his favorite teams and players. Within 6 months, Carlos's listening comprehension had improved dramatically. But more importantly, he had absorbed the natural rhythm and flow of English conversation. The commentator spoke quickly and used lots of expressions that weren't in his textbooks, but because Carlos was so motivated to understand, his brain worked extra hard to decode their speech. He started recognizing patterns in how English speakers express excitement, disappointment, analysis, and prediction. This is the power of choosing listening content that matches your interests. When you care about the subject matter, you push through the language barriers because you want to access the information. You become willing to listen to the same content multiple times, which gives your brain repeated exposure to the same language patterns. You start to associate English with pleasure and curiosity, rather than with stress and obligation. Another crucial aspect of effective listening is variety. Your brain needs to hear English spoken by different people, with different accents, at different speeds, in different contexts. If you only listen to one type of English content, you'll become good at understanding that specific style, but you might struggle when you encounter different varieties of English. This is why I recommend building a diverse listening diet. Mix formal content like news reports with informal content like casual conversations. Listen to both male and female voices. Expose yourself to different English accents: American, British, Australian, Canadian. Include both scripted content like movies and unscripted content like interviews and podcasts. The more variety you include, the more adaptable your listening skills become. I also want to emphasize the importance of listening without the pressure to understand everything immediately. Many students get frustrated when they can't catch every word or follow every detail. But this frustration is counterproductive because it creates stress and anxiety, which actually interfere with language learning. Instead, approach listening with a relaxed, curious attitude. Focus on getting the general meaning rather than catching every single word. When you hear something you don't understand, don't stop and worry about it. Just keep listening. Often, the context will help you figure out the meaning, or the speaker will repeat the same information in different words. Remember that even native speakers don't catch every word in every conversation. We use context, body language, and our knowledge of the topic to fill in gaps. We're comfortable with uncertainty, and we keep listening even when we miss details. This same tolerance for ambiguity will serve you well as an English learner. The listening foundation you build now will support everything else you want to do with English. When you eventually start speaking more, you'll have internalized the natural rhythm and melody of English. When you work on expanding your vocabulary, you'll already have heard many words in context. When you focus on pronunciation, you'll have a library of native speaker models in your memory. Most importantly, extensive listening builds your confidence gradually and naturally. As your comprehension improves, you start to feel more connected to the English-speaking world. You begin to understand jokes, catch cultural references, and follow complex discussions. This growing understanding creates positive momentum that motivates you to keep learning and improving. Let me tell you about Sophie from Paris, who transformed her English by doing something very simple. She copied native speakers. She would listen to a sentence, pause, and repeat it exactly as she heard it, focusing on the melody and rhythm rather than individual words. After 3 months of this practice, people started asking her where she learned to speak so naturally. Sophie came to me with a problem that many of my students share. She could understand English fairly well when she read it, and she could even follow conversations when people spoke slowly and clearly. But when she tried to speak English herself, something was missing. Her words were technically correct, but they sounded flat and unnatural. Native speakers could understand her, but they could immediately tell that English wasn't her first language. What frustrated Sophie most was that she couldn't figure out what was wrong. She knew the right words to use, she understood the meanings, but somehow her English lacked the natural flow that she heard when native speakers talked. She felt like she was speaking English with a French accent and French rhythm, just using English words instead of French ones. That's when I introduced Sophie to something I call the copying method, though it's really just what children do naturally when they're learning their first language. I told Sophie to stop worrying about understanding every word or analyzing what she was hearing. Instead, I wanted her to become like a parrot for a while, just copying the sounds and rhythms she heard, even if she didn't fully understand what she was saying. Sophie was skeptical at first. It seemed too simple, almost childish. But I explained to her that this copying process is how her brain would naturally absorb the music of English. The stress patterns, the intonation, the way sounds flow together in natural speech. These elements of language are just as important as vocabulary and sentence structure, but they can't be learned through textbooks or rules. They have to be absorbed through imitation. I suggested that Sophie start with short video clips from English speakers she found easy to listen to. She chose interviews with actors from movies she enjoyed because their speech was clear and they were talking about topics that interested her. Sophie would play a sentence, pause the video, and then repeat what she had heard, trying to match not just the words but the exact tone and rhythm of the speaker. At first, Sophie felt awkward doing this exercise. She told me it felt like she was acting or pretending to be someone else, but I encouraged her to embrace that feeling. I told her that in a way she was learning to act like a native English speaker, and that's exactly what she needed to do to develop natural-sounding English. Sophie started with very short segments, sometimes just 3 or 4 words at a time. She would listen to a phrase like, "That's really interesting," and focus on copying not just the words, but the way the speaker's voice rose and fell, the way certain syllables were stressed more than others, the way the sounds connected smoothly together. She wasn't analyzing these patterns intellectually. She was absorbing them through physical mimicry. After about 2 weeks of daily copying practice, Sophie noticed something interesting happening. When she spoke English in other contexts, not during her copying exercises, her speech started sounding more natural automatically. She wasn't consciously applying anything she had learned, but somehow her English was beginning to flow with a more native-like rhythm. The breakthrough moment came about a month into Sophie's copying practice. She was having a conversation with an American tourist in Paris who had asked her for directions. After Sophie helped him, the tourist said something that shocked her. "Wow, your English is amazing. Did you live in the United States?" Sophie realized that her months of copying practice had fundamentally changed how her English sounded to native speakers. What made Sophie's copying method so effective was that she focused on the melody of English, rather than just the words. She was training her mouth, her throat, her breathing patterns to produce English sounds the way native speakers do. She was internalizing the rhythm and music of the language at a physical level, not just an intellectual level. Sophie told me that the copying process felt like learning a song. When you learn to sing a song in a foreign language, you don't necessarily understand every word, but you learn to reproduce the sounds, the timing, the emotional expression of the music. That's exactly what Sophie was doing with spoken English. She was learning to sing the song of natural English conversation. After 3 months of consistent copying practice, Sophie's transformation was remarkable. She still had a slight French accent, but her English had a natural flow and rhythm that made it pleasant and easy to listen to. More importantly, Sophie felt confident speaking English because she had internalized the patterns of natural speech. She no longer had to think about how to stress words or where to pause in sentences. These elements had become automatic. What I found fascinating about Sophie's experience was how the copying method affected not just her pronunciation, but her entire approach to English communication. Because she had absorbed so many examples of natural English expression through her copying practice, she started using phrases and expressions that sounded authentically English rather than like French thoughts translated into English words. Sophie began incorporating natural English fillers like "you know" and "I mean" into her speech, not because she had studied these expressions, but because she had heard and copied them so many times that they felt natural. She started using English stress patterns to emphasize important information, and her intonation began carrying emotional meanings the way it does for native speakers. The copying method worked so well for Sophie because it engaged her whole body in the learning process, not just her mind. When she physically imitated native speakers, she was training her muscles, her breathing, her vocal cords, to produce English sounds naturally. This physical training is just as important as mental understanding when it comes to developing fluent speech. Sophie's success with copying also demonstrates something important about language learning motivation. Because she could hear herself improving week by week, because she could feel her English becoming more natural and confident, she stayed motivated to continue the practice. The copying method gave her immediate, tangible feedback about her progress, which kept her engaged and excited about learning. After her initial 3-month copying intensive, Sophie continued using the method but in a more integrated way. Whenever she encountered an English speaker whose pronunciation or expression she admired, she would make mental notes and later practice copying their speech patterns. She had developed an ear for natural English rhythm, and she used that ear to continuously refine her own speaking abilities. Sophie's story illustrates that developing natural-sounding English isn't about memorizing pronunciation rules or studying phonetics. It's about training your body to reproduce the physical patterns of native speech through careful listening and imitation. When you copy native speakers regularly and consistently, you gradually develop the same natural flow and rhythm that makes native speech so effortless and pleasant to listen to. You don't need perfect grammar to communicate effectively in English. Native speakers make grammar mistakes all the time, but we still understand each other perfectly. The goal is communication, not perfection. Start speaking from day one, even if you only copy phrases you've heard. Every time you speak, you're training your mouth muscles and building confidence. I need to share something with you that might surprise you about native English speakers. We make what textbooks would call mistakes constantly in our everyday speech. Just yesterday, I heard my neighbor say, "Me and my husband are going to the store." Technically, according to formal rules, she should have said, "My husband and I are going to the store." But did I misunderstand her message? Of course not. Her communication was perfectly clear and effective, This happens all the time in natural English conversation. We say things like, "Who did you give it to?" instead of, "To whom did you give it?" We use like as a filler word in ways that would make English teachers cringe. We end sentences with prepositions, split infinitives, and use double negatives in casual speech. Yet somehow, we all understand each other perfectly, and our conversations flow naturally and effectively. The reason I'm telling you this is because I want to free you from the prison of perfectionism that keeps so many English learners silent. I've met countless students who understand English well and have plenty of vocabulary, but they rarely speak because they're terrified of making mistakes. They wait and wait for the day when they'll feel ready to speak perfect English. But that day never comes because they're aiming for a standard that even native speakers don't meet. Let me tell you about Marcus from Stockholm, who was trapped in this perfectionism cycle for years. Marcus could write beautiful English emails for his job. His written English was so good that his international colleagues assumed he was a native speaker. But in video conferences, Marcus rarely spoke. When he did contribute to discussions, he would spend so much time mentally checking his sentences for errors that the conversation had moved on to a different topic by the time he was ready to speak. Marcus's fear of making mistakes was actually preventing him from developing the one skill he wanted most: natural, confident speaking ability. He had convinced himself that he needed to speak perfectly or not at all. But speaking perfectly requires practice, and you can't get practice if you never speak, because you're afraid of imperfection. I had to help Marcus understand that speaking English is like playing a sport or learning to drive a car. You don't wait until you can play tennis perfectly before you step onto a tennis court. You don't wait until you can drive perfectly before you start practicing in a parking lot. You improve through doing, through making mistakes, through getting feedback, and through trying again. The first breakthrough for Marcus came when I asked him to simply repeat phrases he heard in English podcasts, without worrying about understanding or analyzing them. I told him to treat it like physical exercise for his mouth and tongue. Just like you need to train your muscles to play a sport effectively, you need to train your speech muscles to produce English sounds naturally. At first, Marcus felt silly just copying phrases without fully understanding them. But after a few weeks, something interesting happened. He started noticing that English phrases were coming to his mind more quickly during his work meetings. Because he had practiced producing English sounds regularly, his mouth and tongue were becoming more comfortable with English speech patterns. The next step was getting Marcus to focus on communication rather than correctness. I gave him a simple challenge: have one short conversation in English every day, focusing only on getting his message across clearly. It didn't matter if his sentences were perfect according to textbook standards. What mattered was whether the other person understood what he was trying to communicate. Marcus started having brief conversations with English-speaking tourists in Stockholm. He would offer directions or restaurant recommendations, focusing entirely on being helpful rather than on speaking perfectly. This shift in focus was transformative. When Marcus stopped worrying about his English and started caring about helping people, his speech became much more natural and fluent. What Marcus discovered was that most people are very forgiving of language mistakes when they can tell you're genuinely trying to communicate with them. Native speakers naturally fill in gaps and understand meaning from context. We are much more focused on what you're trying to tell us than on whether you're following all the rules correctly. This is something I see with international students all the time. The ones who speak the most naturally aren't necessarily the ones with the best technical knowledge of English rules. They're the ones who are most willing to take risks, make mistakes, and keep talking despite imperfection. They understand that speaking is a skill that develops through practice, not through theoretical study. I want you to think about speaking English like learning to ride a bicycle. When you first got on a bike as a child, you probably wobbled, lost your balance, and maybe even fell down a few times. But you didn't give up and decide to study the physics of balance before trying again. You kept getting back on the bike, and gradually your balance improved through experience. Speaking English is exactly the same process. Your first attempts might be wobbly and imperfect, but each time you speak, you're improving your balance with the language. You're training your brain to access English words more quickly, training your mouth to produce English sounds more accurately, and training your confidence to handle real communication situations. One of the most powerful realizations you can have as an English learner is that communication is more important than perfection. When you focus on getting your message across rather than on following rules perfectly, several wonderful things happen. First, you become much more willing to speak, which gives you more practice opportunities. Second, your speech becomes more natural because you're focusing on meaning rather than on form. Third, you build confidence through successful communication experiences. I encourage you to start speaking English from day one of your learning journey, even if you only know a few phrases. Use the phrases you've heard in your listening practice. Don't worry about creating original sentences from rules. Just use the chunks of language you've absorbed through listening. When you order coffee, use the exact phrase you heard someone else use in a movie or podcast. When you greet someone, copy the greeting you've heard native speakers use. This copying approach takes the pressure off creating perfect sentences and allows you to focus on successful communication. As you use these copied phrases more and more, they become natural parts of your active English vocabulary. You start to feel comfortable with them, and gradually you begin combining them in new ways to express your own ideas. Remember that every time you speak English, you're doing something beneficial for your language development. You're training your pronunciation, building your confidence, testing your understanding, and gathering feedback about how well you're communicating. Even if you make mistakes, even if you feel awkward, even if the conversation doesn't go exactly as you hoped, you're still moving forward in your English journey. Reading simple stories, news articles, or even social media posts in English helps you see how the language flows naturally. Don't stop to analyze grammar, just read for understanding and enjoyment. Your brain will automatically notice how sentences are built and how ideas connect together. This subconscious learning is much more powerful than conscious grammar study. I want to share something that transformed my understanding of how reading can accelerate language learning. A few years ago, I met a student named Yuki from Tokyo who had been struggling with English for months using traditional textbooks and exercises. She could memorize vocabulary lists and complete fill-in-the-blank exercises, but when she tried to write emails or have conversations, her English felt mechanical and unnatural. Then Yuki discovered something that changed everything for her English learning journey. She started reading English romance novels, not because anyone told her to, but simply because she loved romantic stories and wanted to read her favorite authors in their original language. At first, she understood maybe 60% of what she was reading, but she was so invested in the stories that she kept going anyway. What happened over the next few months was remarkable. Yuki's written English began flowing more naturally, her speaking became more expressive, and her overall feel for the language improved dramatically. She wasn't studying these improvements. They were happening automatically as a side effect of reading for pleasure. This is the power of reading for natural language patterns rather than studying language as an academic subject. When you read English content that genuinely interests you, your brain absorbs the natural flow and rhythm of written English without you having to consciously analyze it. You see how native speakers actually connect ideas, how they transition between thoughts, how they express emotions and opinions. Think about how differently English flows in a casual blog post compared to a news article, or how dialogue in a novel captures the rhythm of natural speech. When you read widely, you expose yourself to all these different styles and registers of English. Your brain naturally builds a sense of what sounds appropriate in different contexts. I always encourage my students to choose reading material based on their interests rather than their English level. If you love cooking, read English food blogs and recipe websites. If you're interested in technology, follow English tech news and reviews. If you enjoy personal stories, read memoirs or lifestyle articles. When you care about the content, you'll push through language challenges because you want to understand what happens next. Yuki's experience taught me that emotional engagement is crucial for effective language learning through reading. When she was reading romance novels, she wasn't thinking about sentence structure or vocabulary acquisition. She was completely absorbed in the characters' relationships and the plot developments. This emotional investment made her brain work harder to understand the English, which accelerated her language absorption. The key is reading without stopping to analyze every unfamiliar word or construction. Many students make the mistake of treating reading like a puzzle to be solved, looking up every unknown word and trying to parse every sentence structure. But this analytical approach actually interferes with the natural flow of reading and prevents your brain from absorbing language patterns holistically. Instead, read the way you read in your native language, for meaning, for enjoyment, for information. When you encounter words or phrases you don't know, try to understand them from context. Often, the surrounding sentences will give you clues about meaning. Even if you don't understand everything perfectly, keep reading. Your brain is still absorbing valuable language patterns even when you're not consciously understanding every detail. I remember working with a student named Luis from Barcelona who was frustrated because he felt like his English wasn't improving, despite months of study. When I asked about his reading habits, he told me he was working through English textbooks, carefully translating every sentence and looking up every unfamiliar word. His reading speed was incredibly slow, and he wasn't enjoying the process at all. I suggested that Luis try a completely different approach. Instead of textbooks, I encouraged him to find English content related to his hobby of photography. Luis started reading photography blogs, equipment reviews, and articles about techniques and composition. Suddenly, he was reading much more English content because he was genuinely interested in learning about photography. Within a few weeks, Luis noticed that his English comprehension was improving rapidly. Because he already understood photography concepts, he could figure out technical English terms from context. Because he was emotionally invested in the subject matter, he was motivated to understand detailed explanations and reviews. Most importantly, he was seeing how English writers naturally explained complex concepts, described equipment, and shared experiences. This contextual reading gave Luis something that textbooks never could: exposure to natural English expression in a field he cared about. He absorbed not just vocabulary, but the patterns of how English speakers actually communicate about topics that matter to them. Social media can also be a powerful reading resource if you use it strategically. Following English-speaking accounts related to your interests gives you daily exposure to casual, contemporary English. You see how people express opinions, share experiences, and interact with each other in informal written English. This type of reading helps you understand cultural references and contemporary expressions that don't appear in traditional textbooks. The beauty of reading for natural patterns is that it works on multiple levels simultaneously. While you're enjoying a story or learning about a topic that interests you, your brain is unconsciously processing how English sentences flow together, how paragraphs are structured, how writers transition between ideas. You're absorbing the rhythm and melody of written English without having to study it directly. Over time, this absorbed sense of natural English flow influences your own writing and speaking. You start to feel when sentences sound awkward or when ideas don't connect smoothly. You develop an intuitive sense of what sounds like natural English expression versus what sounds like translated thoughts from your native language. Reading also exposes you to vocabulary in meaningful contexts, which helps you remember and use new words more effectively. When you encounter a word while reading about something you're interested in, you understand not just the definition, but how the word feels in context, what kinds of situations it's used in, and what emotional or cultural associations it carries. The most important thing about reading for language learning is consistency, rather than intensity. Reading a little bit every day in English is much more beneficial than reading for hours once a week. Daily reading keeps English patterns active in your mind and creates steady progress over time. You don't need to travel to an English-speaking country to create immersion. Change your phone settings to English, listen to English music, watch English videos, and think in English as much as possible. The goal is to surround yourself with the language so it becomes a natural part of your daily life, rather than something you only study for 1 hour. I want to tell you about one of the most successful English learners I've ever worked with, and she never left her home country of Brazil. Her name was Anna, and when she first contacted me, she was frustrated because everyone kept telling her that she needed to live in an English-speaking country to become truly fluent. She couldn't afford to travel or study abroad, and she was convinced that this meant she would never achieve the level of English she dreamed of. That's when I introduced Anna to the concept of creating immersion at home. I explained to her that immersion isn't really about geography. It's about how much English you encounter and interact with on a daily basis. You can live in London for years and still not be immersed in English if you only socialize with people from your home country and consume media in your native language. Conversely, you can create a rich English environment right where you are if you're strategic about it. The first change I suggested to Anna was something that might seem small, but has a powerful psychological impact: changing her phone's language settings to English. At first, Anna resisted this idea because she was worried it would be inconvenient. But I explained that this one change would mean she would encounter English dozens of times throughout her day, every time she checked her phone, sent a message, or used an app. Within a week, Anna told me something interesting. She said that having her phone in English made her feel like she was living partially in an English-speaking world. Every notification, every menu, every app interface was giving her brain English input. More importantly, it was normalizing English as a language she used for practical, everyday purposes, rather than just something she studied in books. The next step was expanding Anna's English environment to include entertainment and information consumption. Instead of watching Brazilian TV shows in her free time, Anna started watching English series with subtitles. Instead of listening to music in Portuguese during her commute, she switched to English podcasts and songs. Instead of reading Brazilian news websites during her lunch break, she began following English news sources. What happened was remarkable. Anna started thinking about her daily life in English because so much of her information input was coming in English. When she heard about a news event through English media, she would naturally think about it using the English words and phrases she had heard. When she listened to English songs repeatedly, those lyrics and expressions became part of her internal vocabulary. This is the power of the immersion mindset. When English becomes the primary language through which you consume information and entertainment, your brain starts treating it as a natural tool for thinking, rather than just a subject to be studied. You begin to associate English with real experiences, emotions, and ideas, rather than with classroom exercises and textbooks. Anna also made an interesting discovery about thinking in English. She had always assumed that thinking in English was something that would happen automatically once she became fluent enough. But I encouraged her to practice thinking in English deliberately, starting with simple situations. When she was grocery shopping, she would try to think about her shopping list in English. When she was planning her day, she would think through her schedule using English phrases she had learned. At first, Anna found this thinking practice challenging because she didn't have English words for everything she wanted to express. But instead of switching back to Portuguese, I encouraged her to work around these vocabulary gaps. If she didn't know the English word for something, she could describe it using words she did know, or she could make a mental note to look up that word later. This thinking practice accelerated Anna's English development in unexpected ways. Because she was trying to think in English regularly, she became much more aware of gaps in her vocabulary and expression. She started paying closer attention to how English speakers described everyday activities and emotions because she needed those expressions for her own internal dialogue. Anna's immersion environment also included changing her social media consumption to English. She started following English-speaking accounts related to her interests, fitness, cooking, and travel. Her social media feeds became streams of natural, contemporary English rather than Portuguese content. This gave her daily exposure to informal English, slang, and cultural references that don't appear in textbooks. The transformation in Anna's English was dramatic and relatively quick. Within 6 months of creating her home immersion environment, she was thinking predominantly in English, dreaming in English, and expressing complex ideas with natural fluency. People who met her online assumed she had lived in an English-speaking country for years. What Anna discovered was that successful immersion is about consistency and integration rather than intensity. She wasn't spending hours each day studying English formally. Instead, she had made English a natural part of her daily routine. Every day, throughout the day, she was encountering and using English in meaningful contexts. One of the most powerful aspects of Anna's approach was that it made English feel normal and practical rather than foreign and academic. When your phone is in English, when your entertainment is in English, when your information sources are in English, the language stops feeling like something separate from your real life. It becomes a tool you use naturally for the things you care about. Anna also learned to be patient with herself during the adjustment period. The first few weeks of having her phone in English were sometimes frustrating when she couldn't immediately find the settings she needed. Watching English videos without subtitles was challenging at first. But she pushed through this initial discomfort because she could see that her comprehension was improving week by week. The immersion mindset also changed Anna's relationship with mistakes and imperfection. Because she was using English for real purposes throughout her day rather than just practicing it in controlled exercises, She became comfortable with uncertainty and partial understanding. She learned to function effectively in English even when she didn't understand everything perfectly, which is exactly how native speakers navigate their own language. Creating immersion at home requires some discipline and commitment, but it's completely achievable regardless of your location or financial situation. The key is making English your default language for as many daily activities as possible. Every time you choose English content over content in your native language, every time you think through a problem in English, every time you consume information through English sources, you're strengthening your brain's English processing abilities. The goal is to reach a point where English feels like a natural part of your mental environment, rather than something you have to consciously switch into when you want to practice. Many English learners worry about making mistakes, but mistakes are actually signs that you're trying to communicate. Native speakers understand you even when your grammar isn't perfect. Focus on getting your message across clearly rather than speaking perfectly. The more you practice real communication, the more natural your English will become over time. I need to share something with you that might completely change how you think about mistakes in English learning. Last month, I was having coffee with my friend Sarah, who's a native English speaker from Chicago. During our conversation, she said something like, "Me and Tom went to that new restaurant yesterday, and it was so good that we literally died." Now, if we were being technical about it, Sarah made two mistakes in that sentence. She should have said Tom and I instead of me and Tom, and she used literally when she obviously didn't actually die at the restaurant. But here's the thing. I understood her perfectly. Her message was completely clear, and her enthusiasm about the restaurant came through beautifully. Nobody stopped the conversation to correct her language, and nobody thought less of her intelligence or communication abilities. This is how real English communication works every single day. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand that successful communication is not about perfection, it's about connection and understanding. When you focus too much on avoiding mistakes, you often end up avoiding communication altogether, which is the opposite of what you need to improve your English. I remember working with a student named Chen from Shanghai, who was absolutely terrified of making mistakes when speaking English. Chen had studied English for years and had an impressive vocabulary, but in conversation, he would often pause for long periods, calculating each sentence in his head to make sure it was perfect before speaking. By the time he was ready to contribute to a discussion, the conversation had usually moved on to a completely different topic. Chen's fear of mistakes was actually preventing him from developing the very skill he wanted most: natural, flowing conversation ability. He had convinced himself that people would judge him harshly for any errors, but when I introduced him to native English speakers, he discovered something surprising. They were much more patient and understanding than he had expected, and they were genuinely interested in communicating with him despite his imperfect English. The breakthrough came when Chen started focusing on sharing his experiences and ideas rather than on producing perfect sentences. He began telling stories about his life in Shanghai, describing his work as a software engineer, and asking questions about American culture. As soon as Chen shifted his attention from language perfection to genuine communication, his English became much more natural and engaging. What Chen learned was that native speakers are incredibly skilled at understanding meaning even when the language isn't technically perfect. We use context, body language, tone of voice, and our general knowledge of the world to fill in gaps and interpret intended meanings. When someone says, "I go to store yesterday," every native speaker immediately understands that they went to the store yesterday, even though the verb tense isn't technically correct. This tolerance for imperfection exists because native speakers make mistakes constantly in casual speech. We say things like, "Where are you at?" instead of "Where are you?" We use who when we should use whom. We split infinitives, end sentences with prepositions, and use double negatives. Yet somehow we all understand each other perfectly and communicate effectively. I want to share another student story that perfectly illustrates this point. Maria from Mexico City was convinced that her English was terrible because her teacher constantly corrected her mistakes in class. She felt embarrassed and frustrated every time she spoke because she knew there were errors in her sentences. Then Maria had to help an English-speaking tourist who was lost in her city. Despite her fears about making mistakes, Maria successfully gave directions, recommended restaurants, and even had a pleasant conversation about cultural differences between Mexico and the United States. The tourist thanked her warmly and told her that her English was excellent and very easy to understand. This experience was transformative for Maria because she realized that her teacher's corrections in class had created a false impression of her actual communication abilities. In the real world, her English was perfectly functional and effective. The small errors that seemed so important in the classroom were completely irrelevant when it came to actual communication with native speakers. This is why I always encourage my students to seek out real communication opportunities rather than focusing exclusively on formal study. When you have authentic conversations with English speakers, you quickly learn what kinds of mistakes actually interfere with communication and what kinds are completely ignorable. Most mistakes that beginning and intermediate learners worry about fall into the ignorable category. Missing articles, small verb tense errors, and word order variations rarely prevent native speakers from understanding your intended meaning. We're much more focused on what you're trying to tell us than on whether you're following all the technical rules perfectly. The mistakes that do interfere with communication are usually related to pronunciation or vocabulary choice rather than technical accuracy. If you mispronounce a word so severely that it sounds like a different word, that might cause confusion. If you use a word that means something completely different from what you intended, that might require clarification. But these issues are easily resolved in real conversation through questions and repetition. What's beautiful about focusing on communication rather than perfection is that your accuracy naturally improves over time through practice. When you speak English regularly with native speakers, you unconsciously absorb correct patterns through exposure. You hear how native speakers express the same ideas you're trying to communicate, and gradually your own expression becomes more natural and accurate. The key insight is that accuracy follows fluency, not the other way around. Children learning their first language become fluent communicators long before they master all the technical rules of their language. They focus on getting their messages across, and the details of correct usage develop naturally through continued exposure and practice. This same process works for adult language learners, but only if you're willing to prioritize communication over perfection. Every conversation you have in English, even if it includes mistakes, is valuable practice that moves you closer to natural fluency. Every time you successfully communicate an idea or feeling in English, you're building confidence and strengthening your language abilities. I encourage you to embrace mistakes as a natural and necessary part of the learning process. Instead of viewing errors as failures, try to see them as evidence that you're pushing your boundaries and attempting real communication. The more you speak, the more comfortable you become with the natural flow of English conversation, and the more your accuracy improves automatically through experience. Instead of memorizing word lists with translations, learn new words in context by seeing how they're used in real situations. When you encounter a new word while listening or reading, try to understand its meaning from the situation. This method helps you remember words better and use them more naturally in your own conversations. I want to share a fascinating discovery I made about vocabulary learning that completely changed how I teach English. A few years ago, I was working with two students who had very different approaches to building their vocabulary. The first student, Roberto from Lima, spent hours every week creating flashcards with English words on one side and Spanish translations on the other. He could memorize hundreds of words this way and score well on vocabulary tests. The second student, Fatima from Casablanca, rarely used flashcards but consumed massive amounts of English content, movies, books, podcasts, and conversations. After 6 months, something surprising happened. When Roberto tried to use his memorized vocabulary in real conversations, he often used words incorrectly or in unnatural ways. He knew the dictionary definitions, but he didn't understand the subtle meanings, emotional connotations, or appropriate context for these words. Fatima, on the other hand, used a smaller vocabulary, but with remarkable naturalness and accuracy. Her words fit perfectly into conversations and sounded authentically English. This experience taught me that vocabulary learning isn't really about collecting words like stamps in an album. It's about understanding how words live and breathe in real communication situations. When you learn words through context, by encountering them in meaningful situations where you can observe how they're used, you absorb much more than just definitions. You learn the personality of each word, its emotional flavor, and its social appropriateness. Let me give you a concrete example of why context matters so much. Think about the English word slim. If you look it up in a dictionary, you'll find a simple definition about being thin or narrow. But if you learn this word through context by hearing it used in real situations, you discover that slim has a positive connotation when describing people, unlike words like skinny or scrawny. You learn that we say slim chance to mean a small possibility, and slim pickings to describe limited options. You understand that calling someone slim is generally considered a compliment, while calling them skinny might not be. This rich understanding of how words actually function in English comes only through experiencing them in natural contexts, not through memorizing isolated definitions. When you encounter vocabulary through listening and reading, you see words in action, working together with other words to create meaning and emotion. I remember helping a student named Kenji from Osaka who was frustrated because he had memorized thousands of English words but still felt like his speaking was unnatural. Kenji would use words that were technically correct but sounded awkward or overly formal in casual conversation. For example, he might say, "I will terminate this conversation now," instead of "I have to go," or "let me conclude," instead of "let me wrap up." The problem wasn't that Kenji's vocabulary was wrong. It was that he had learned words as isolated items rather than as parts of living language. He didn't understand that different words carry different levels of formality, different emotional tones, and different social implications. This kind of nuanced understanding can only come from observing how words are actually used by native speakers in real situations. I encouraged Kenji to stop studying vocabulary lists and instead start collecting examples of natural English expression through his favorite content. Kenji loved cooking, so he began watching English cooking shows and food documentaries. Instead of looking up every unfamiliar word immediately, he would try to understand meanings from context first. When a chef said the sauce was rich and decadent, Kenji could tell from the chef's tone and facial expression that these were positive descriptions, even before he knew the exact definitions. When someone described a dish as comforting, Kenji understood from the context that this meant the food made people feel good emotionally, not just physically satisfied. This contextual learning gave Kenji something that vocabulary lists never could: an intuitive sense of which words feel appropriate in different situations. He started using words like amazing and incredible to express enthusiasm about food, because he had heard native speakers use these words in similar contexts hundreds of times. The beautiful thing about learning vocabulary through context is that your brain automatically makes connections between new words and situations where they're useful. When you hear the word exhausted in a story about someone who worked long hours, your brain files that word away with emotional and situational associations. Later, when you're in a similar situation, that word is more likely to come to mind naturally. This is completely different from flashcard learning, where words exist in isolation without emotional or situational connections. When you memorize that exhausted means very tired, you have the definition but not the feeling or the context that makes the word come alive in real communication. Context-based vocabulary learning also helps you understand the social and cultural meanings of words, not just their dictionary definitions. When you hear English speakers use words like awesome or cool to express approval, you learn that these words carry a casual, friendly tone. When you observe that certain words are used more often by younger speakers or in informal situations, you develop social awareness about vocabulary choices. I always encourage my students to become word detectives when they encounter unfamiliar vocabulary. Instead of immediately reaching for a dictionary, try to guess the meaning from the surrounding context. Look for clues in the situation, the speaker's tone of voice, the reactions of other people, or the general flow of the conversation. This detective work engages your brain much more actively than simply looking up definitions. When you work to understand meaning from context, you're exercising the same skills that native speakers use constantly. We don't stop conversations to look up words we don't recognize. We use context clues to figure out approximate meanings and keep the communication flowing. Even when you do look up new words eventually, the contextual foundation you've built makes the definitions much more meaningful and memorable. You're not just learning abstract definitions. You're confirming and expanding your contextual understanding of how words work in real English communication. One of my most successful vocabulary students was Isabella from Milan, who developed what she called her word collection journal. Instead of making traditional vocabulary lists, Isabella would write down interesting phrases and expressions she encountered in English content, along with notes about the situations where she heard them used. She didn't translate these phrases. She described the context where they appeared and how they made her feel. This approach helped Isabella build a vocabulary that was naturally organized around situations and emotions, rather than alphabetical or thematic categories. When she wanted to express excitement, she had a collection of phrases she had observed excited English speakers using. When she needed to show sympathy, she could draw on expressions she had heard in comforting contexts. Design your daily routine to include English naturally. Listen to English podcasts during your commute, watch English videos while exercising, or read English articles about topics you love. The key is making English a pleasant and regular part of your life, rather than a boring study session. Consistency beats intensity when it comes to language learning. I want to tell you about a remarkable transformation I witnessed with one of my students, and it all started with a simple question I asked her. Priya from Mumbai had been struggling with English for months, attending classes twice a week and doing homework assignments, but she felt like she wasn't making real progress. When I asked her how much English she encountered outside of those formal study sessions, she realized the answer was almost none. Her entire English learning was confined to 2 hours per week in a classroom. That's when I introduced Priya to the concept of environmental English learning, the idea that you can transform your daily routine into a natural English learning experience without adding extra study time to your schedule. Instead of trying to find more hours in the day for English practice, we redesigned the activities she was already doing so that they could serve double duty as both entertainment and language learning. Priya's commute to work was 45 minutes each way, which she had been spending listening to music in Hindi or just sitting in silence. I suggested she try listening to English podcasts about topics that genuinely interested her. Priya loved personal development and entrepreneurship, so we found several English podcasts hosted by business experts and life coaches. At first, Priya was concerned that she wouldn't understand enough to make the listening worthwhile, but I explained to her that understanding doesn't have to be perfect to be beneficial. Even if she only caught 60 or 70% of what the podcast hosts were saying, her brain was still absorbing English rhythm, pronunciation patterns, and natural expression. The key was choosing content she cared enough about to stay motivated even when comprehension was challenging. Within 2 weeks, Priya noticed something interesting happening during her commute. She found herself looking forward to her favorite English podcasts and actually feeling disappointed when her journey ended before an episode was finished. The English learning had stopped feeling like work and started feeling like entertainment. She was getting nearly 8 hours of English listening input every week just from her regular commute, without adding any extra time to her schedule. The next change we made was to Priya's evening exercise routine. She had been watching Indian television shows while using her treadmill at home. I suggested switching to English content that would keep her entertained and motivated to exercise while simultaneously providing language input. Priya chose English fitness videos and health documentaries because they combined two of her interests, staying healthy and improving her English. This change had an unexpected benefit. Because Priya was physically active while listening to English, her brain seemed to absorb the language more effectively. The combination of physical movement and language input created a powerful learning experience. She started naturally associating English with positive feelings of accomplishment and energy from her workouts. Priya also transformed her reading habits by switching from Hindi news websites to English news sources and blogs about entrepreneurship. Instead of reading these articles as language study materials, she read them for the information and insights they contained. This shift in focus made a huge difference in her reading experience. When you read for content rather than for language analysis, you naturally read faster and more fluently, and you absorb vocabulary and expressions in meaningful contexts. The most important principle underlying Priya's transformation was integration rather than addition. Instead of trying to add new English study activities to an already busy schedule, we integrated English into activities she was already doing. This made the language learning sustainable and enjoyable rather than burdensome. Within 3 months of redesigning her daily routine, Priya's English had improved dramatically. Her listening comprehension was much stronger because of all the podcast input during her commutes. Her vocabulary had expanded naturally through reading about topics she cared about. Most importantly, her confidence had grown because English had become a normal, comfortable part of her daily life, rather than something foreign and academic. I've seen this environmental approach work for students with all kinds of schedules and interests. Marco from Rome integrated English into his love of cooking by watching English cooking shows and reading English recipe blogs. He wasn't studying English. He was learning to make new dishes. But the language learning happened automatically as a side effect of pursuing his hobby. Jennifer from Seoul combined English with her fitness goals by following English-speaking fitness influencers on social media and watching English workout videos. The language learning was almost invisible because she was focused on improving her physical health, but she was getting daily exposure to natural English conversation about health, motivation, and exercise techniques. The key insight that all these successful students discovered is that language learning doesn't have to be a separate activity that competes with your other interests and responsibilities. When you integrate English into activities you already enjoy, the learning becomes effortless and sustainable. This approach works because it leverages your existing motivation and interests. When you're genuinely curious about the content you're consuming in English, your brain works harder to understand the language. When you're emotionally engaged with English content, you remember vocabulary and expressions more effectively. When English becomes associated with pleasure and personal interests, rather than with obligation and study, you naturally seek out more English input. I always encourage my students to think about their daily routines and identify opportunities for English integration. Do you spend time on social media? Follow English accounts related to your interests? Do you listen to music during your workout? Try English podcasts or audiobooks instead. Do you read articles online during lunch breaks? Switch to English sources about topics you care about. The beauty of this environmental approach is that it creates positive momentum. As your English improves through natural exposure, you become more confident about consuming English content. As you become more confident, you seek out more challenging and interesting English materials. As your vocabulary and comprehension expand, you can enjoy more sophisticated content, which accelerates your learning even further. Consistency really does beat intensity when it comes to language learning. 30 minutes of English input every day through activities you already enjoy is much more effective than 3 hours of intensive study once a week. Daily exposure keeps English active in your mind and creates steady, sustainable progress over time. The most successful English learners I've worked with are those who have made English a natural part of their lifestyle, rather than a subject they study. They consume English content not because they should, but because they want to. They've discovered that English can be a gateway to information, entertainment, and connections that enrich their lives beyond just language improvement. This environmental approach also eliminates the mental resistance that many people feel toward language learning. When English is woven into activities you already love, it doesn't feel like extra work or sacrifice. It feels like an enhancement to things you were going to do anyway. Now that you understand how to learn English without getting stuck in grammar rules, I want you to choose one activity you'll start doing today. Will you begin listening to English podcasts during your daily walk, or maybe change your phone settings to English? Remember, small, consistent actions lead to big results. If this episode helped you see English learning in a new way, please give it a like and subscribe to the English Talk community. Share this with someone who's struggling with grammar rules and needs to hear this message. I'll see you in the next episode where we'll explore more ways to build your English fluency naturally. Right now, as you're listening to these words, I want you to make a decision that could change your English learning journey forever. You've heard all these stories about Maria from Madrid, Ahmed from Cairo, Sophie from Paris, and so many other students who transformed their English by focusing on natural input instead of grammar rules. Now it's your turn to take action. I don't want you to try to change everything at once. That's a recipe for overwhelm and giving up after a few days. Instead, I want you to pick just one simple change that you can implement immediately, today, right after you finish listening to this episode. Think about your daily routine and identify one opportunity where you can easily add English input to something you're already doing. Maybe you spend 20 minutes every morning drinking coffee and checking social media. What if you use that time to listen to an English podcast about a topic you love? Maybe you drive to work every day listening to music or radio in your native language. What if you switch to English podcasts or audiobooks during that commute? Maybe you watch television in the evening to relax after work. What if you chose English shows with subtitles in your language at first, then gradually moved to English subtitles, then no subtitles at all? The specific activity doesn't matter as much as the commitment to consistency. Choose something that feels easy and enjoyable, not something that feels like a chore. Remember, we want to associate English with pleasure and curiosity, not with obligation and stress. If you love cooking, start with English cooking videos. If you're interested in fitness, begin with English workout content. If you enjoy news and current events, switch to English news sources. I want to share something important with you about how change actually happens in language learning. Most people expect dramatic transformations to occur quickly, but real progress happens through small, consistent actions repeated over weeks and months. Every day that you choose English content over content in your native language, every day that you listen to natural English conversation, every day that you expose your brain to authentic English input, you're making deposits in your language learning account. You might not notice the progress day by day, just like you don't notice your hair growing each day. But if you stick with this approach for 3 months, 6 months, a year, you'll look back and be amazed at how much your English has improved. You'll find yourself understanding conversations that would have been completely confusing before. You'll discover that English words and phrases come to your mind more quickly and naturally. You'll realize that you're thinking in English without forcing it to happen. The students who succeed with this natural approach have one thing in common: they trust the process even when progress feels slow. They understand that their brains are working constantly to absorb and process all the English input they're receiving, even when that work is happening below the level of conscious awareness. They don't panic when they don't understand everything they hear or read. They just keep exposing themselves to more and more natural English, confident that comprehension will improve gradually over time. I also want you to be kind to yourself during this process. There will be days when you feel frustrated because English still seems difficult. There will be moments when you wonder if this approach is really working. These feelings are completely normal and temporary. Every successful English learner I've worked with has experienced doubt and frustration along the way. The difference between those who succeed and those who give up is persistence in the face of temporary setbacks. Remember that you're not just learning English, you're rewiring your brain to process a second language naturally. This is an incredible accomplishment that deserves patience and self-compassion. Celebrate small victories, like understanding a joke in an English video or following a conversation without subtitles. These moments of success will multiply over time if you stay consistent with your English input. I want to make this as easy as possible for you to get started. Right now, before you do anything else, open your phone and make one small change. Change your phone's language to English, or download one English podcast app, or subscribe to one English YouTube channel about a topic you enjoy. Don't overthink this choice. Just pick something and commit to trying it for 1 week. If you found value in today's episode, if something I said resonated with you or gave you hope about your English learning journey, I would be incredibly grateful if you would hit the like button and subscribe to the English Talk community. These simple actions help other English learners discover this natural approach to language learning. More importantly, think about someone in your life who's struggling with English learning, someone who's been stuck studying grammar rules and feeling frustrated with their progress. Share this episode with them. Send them the link and tell them that there's a different way to approach English that focuses on enjoyment and natural input instead of academic study. Your sharing could be exactly what they need to break through their current limitations and discover the joy of learning English naturally. The journey you're starting today is going to transform not just your English abilities, but your confidence, your opportunities, and your connections with people around the world. English will become a bridge to new experiences, new knowledge, and new relationships that will enrich your life in ways you can't even imagine right now.